He needs someone responsible managing those assets, someone who actually understands money. My brother didn't even lower his voice when he said it. He was looking straight at the mediator, not at me, like I wasn't even sitting 3 feet away from him. I didn't flinch, I didn't sigh. I just glanced at the document in front of me and quietly turned it face down. 4 minutes. That was how long before everything he'd built over 2 years would come apart at the seams. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who had already decided you were the problem before you said a single word? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever been the person everyone had already written off. I want to know how many of us have been in that chair. My brother's name is Daniel. He's 41, 12 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he had a gift for making other people's failures sound like his personal burden. He wore that burden well. The right suits, the right handshake, the right way of pausing before he spoke so everyone leaned in slightly. He'd built a career in commercial real estate in Calgary, and our mother had always called him the steady one, which meant, quietly, that I was the other kind. I'm Maya. I'm 29. I'm a forensic accountant, and I am the only person in my family who has ever actually read a contract to the end. When our father passed away 18 months ago, he left behind a modest estate, a paid-off house in Oakville, a registered investment account worth roughly $680,000, and a small rental property in Hamilton that pulled in about $2,200 a month. Not a fortune by any measure, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough, apparently, for Daniel to decide he needed to be in charge of it. The estate was split equally between the two of us, with a 2-year administration period during which neither of us could liquidate the primary assets without joint written consent. Our father had been careful about that. He'd seen enough family fallouts in his own life to put guardrails in the will. Daniel had spent the last 8 months trying to get me to sign a financial management agreement that would give him sole discretionary authority over the investment account for efficiency. I had read it. Then I had read it again. Then I had taken it to a colleague and watched her eyebrows rise slowly toward her hairline. I said I needed more time to review it. He told our aunt I was being difficult. He told our mother I was emotionally reactive and not thinking clearly since Dad died. He told his own lawyer, and I know this because people talk that his younger sister had always been unstable, that grief had made it worse, and that, frankly, someone needed to step in before she made decisions that would hurt both of them. So here we were, a formal estate mediation hearing at a law firm on Bay Street in Toronto. Daniel had requested it. He'd brought his lawyer, a man named Richard, who wore cufflinks shaped like gavels, which I found optimistic. He'd also brought our mother and our Aunt Patricia, who sat in the row of chairs along the wall behind him like a small, well-dressed jury. The mediator's name was Susan Holloway. She was in her late 50s, unhurried, and she had a way of writing notes without looking down at her paper that made everyone in the room vaguely nervous. Good. Nervous was good. Daniel opened by laying out his case with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed it over dinner the previous 3 nights. He was concerned, he said. He had observed, over the past several months, a troubling pattern of inaction on my part. The investment account had seen no strategic movement. The Hamilton property had a minor repair backlog. He had suggested twice that we refinance at current rates, and I had failed to respond in a timely manner. He let that last part sit in the air. Our mother nodded slightly. Aunt Patricia pressed her lips together. In the psychology of family dynamics, there is a pattern called Darvo-deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. The person causing the harm reframes themselves as the concerned party. They become the responsible sibling, the worried son, the one who is simply trying to hold things together while the other falls apart. It is extraordinarily effective in rooms like this one, where feelings carry weight and documents carry more, and most people cannot tell the difference between the two until it's too late. Daniel was doing it well. I had to give him that. I didn't react. I kept my hands folded on the table. I kept my face neutral and open, the way you learn to when you spend your career reading financial statements looking for the one number that doesn't belong. You learn to be very still. You learn that the moment you react is the moment you stop seeing clearly. Miss Holloway, Daniel continued, we're asking the mediation to recommend the appointment of a sole estate trustee myself with authority to act on behalf of the estate without requiring joint consent for each transaction. My sister's reluctance to engage is creating real financial risk. Every month we delay costs us money. He gestured toward Richard, who opened a folder and slid a neatly tabbed document across the table toward Susan Holloway. This is a summary of missed opportunities over the past 8 months, Richard said. GIC renewals that rolled over at suboptimal rates. A refinancing window in March that closed without action. A maintenance issue at the Hamilton property that has now escalated in estimated repair cost. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down. The look wasn't angry. It was almost kind, which was worse. The look that says, "I'm doing this for you." "You can see what I mean," he said, his voice softening. "I'm not trying to cut Maya out. I just need to be able to move." Susan Holloway set the document down and looked at me over her reading glasses. "Maya," she said, "you've heard your brother's concerns. Would you like to respond?" Behind Daniel, our mother shifted forward slightly in her chair. She was waiting for me to get emotional. She was waiting for the version of me from 10 years ago, the one who cried at the dinner table, who raised her voice, who stormed off, and then felt guilty about it for weeks. That version of me had been very useful to Daniel for a very long time. I picked up my pen. I set it back down. I looked at Susan Holloway, not at Daniel. "I'd like to respond to the documents first," I said, "and then I'd like to submit some of my own." Richard glanced at Daniel. Daniel smiled, just barely. He thought I was stalling. He thought I was about to produce something disorganized and defensive, the paper equivalent of the emotional outburst I was famous for in this family's mythology. I reached into the leather portfolio on my lap and placed a blue folder on the table in front of me. I didn't open it yet. "Daniel is right about one thing," I said. "I have not been moving quickly on the estate. I let the GICs roll over. I didn't pursue the refinancing window in March. I have 18 months of email responses that took me several days each, sometimes longer." I paused. "He's about to tell you that's negligence. I'd like to show you what it actually was." I opened the folder. The first page was a transaction log, 14 months of it. Every movement in and out of the estate's investment account, time-stamped and flagged. The account had not been sitting idle while I dragged my feet. The account had been bleeding. "Beginning 11 months ago," I said, sliding a copy toward Susan Holloway and one toward Richard, a series of transfers began originating from the estate's secondary brokerage account. The account used for dividend reinvestment, the one that required only one trustee's signature for transactions under $25,000. I looked at Daniel. "Your client has been making withdrawals," I said to Richard, keeping my voice even. 14 of them, ranging from $18,000 to $24,500 each. Always just under the threshold that would have required my co-signature. All within the last 11 months. All transferred to a numbered company registered in Alberta. The room went very quiet. Aunt Patricia stopped moving entirely. "That's Daniel started. The total," I continued, "is $287,000. Richard put his pen down. He did it carefully, like he was afraid of making noise. Susan Holloway was reading. She turned to the second page, then the third. Her face gave nothing away, but she had stopped writing. "I want to be precise about something," I said. "I noticed the first transfer 9 months ago. I flagged it in my own records and I said nothing. Not to my mother, not to my aunt, not to Daniel. I gave no indication that I had seen it." I turned to the fourth page of the folder, which was a printed summary from a forensic tracing report I had prepared myself, using the same methodology I use for my professional clients. "I waited," I said, "and I documented." Daniel's lawyer leaned toward him and said something under his breath. Daniel shook his head once, tight and small. "Here's what I need you to understand about why I waited. In Ontario, a single misappropriation of estate funds under a certain threshold can be addressed as a civil matter, a repayment order, a mediated settlement. Daniel would have returned a portion of the money, paid a penalty, and retained enough goodwill in the family narrative to walk away, looking like someone who made a mistake under grief-induced stress. I'm a forensic accountant. I know exactly where each threshold sits. And I knew that if I waited until the total exceeded $250,000 and the transfers could be shown to follow a deliberate pattern of structuring, keeping each transaction just under the co-signature limit, that is no longer a civil estate dispute. That becomes a criminal matter under the Criminal Code of Canada, fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, potentially money laundering structuring provisions. The mandatory starting point for sentencing in a case like that is not a fine. It's a conversation about years. "You waited on purpose," Susan Holloway said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I let him build the case," I said, "because I needed the case to be undeniable." Daniel's chair scraped back. He stood up. I don't think he meant to. It was reflexive and then sat down again. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. "She's fabricating this," Daniel said, and his voice had gone tight and strange. "She's had it out for me since Dad died. She's always been jealous." I slid the fifth page across the table. "This is the certificate of incorporation for the numbered company in Alberta," I said. 1847392 Alberta Limited, incorporated 14 months ago. The sole director is listed as Sandra Kowalski. I looked at Daniel, not unkindly. "That's your girlfriend's last name before she got married the first time." I didn't know that until 4 months ago. Once I did, the incorporation record was publicly available. I just had to look. Aunt Patricia made a sound I had never heard her make before. Our mother said Daniel's name, very quietly, and it didn't sound like a defense. Daniel looked at his lawyer. Richard was reading the incorporation document. He was not looking at Daniel. Here is the part that I want to say carefully, because this is the part I thought about for a very long time. I did not do any of this to hurt my brother. I didn't build this case out of grief or spite, or the years of dinner tables where he talked over me and I pretended not to notice. I did it because I am the executor of my father's estate. That is not an honorary title. It's a legal responsibility, and I took it seriously, and the person I was responsible for protecting was my father's legacy and the beneficiaries of his wishes, which included both of us. Daniel had counted on me being too emotional to be thorough. He had spent 12 years watching me be the unstable one, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, that I would always be easier to outmaneuver than to treat as an equal. That was his mistake. Not the greed. Greed is old and human and almost understandable. The mistake was underestimating what I do for a living. Susan Holloway closed the folder. She folded her hands on top of it. "Mr. Holloway," she said, turning to Daniel, "I'm going to pause this proceeding. You should be aware that as mediator, I have a duty to flag potential criminal conduct that comes to light in proceedings I oversee. I'm also going to suggest strongly that you speak privately with your counsel before we continue." Richard was already leaning toward Daniel with his hand up between them like a partition. But Daniel wasn't looking at his lawyer. He was looking at me, and his face had gone through several things and landed somewhere I hadn't expected. Not rage, not panic. Something more like bewilderment. Like he was genuinely trying to work out when I had become someone he didn't recognize. I know that look. I had worn it myself, the first time I understood what he had been doing. I held his gaze, and then I set the final page on the table and slid it toward him slowly. "This is a voluntary disclosure and repayment agreement," I said. "I had it drawn up 6 weeks ago. It requires full repayment of the $287,000 within 90 days, a formal resignation from any trustee or executor role, and a notarized acknowledgement of the transactions and their nature. In exchange, I do not refer the matter to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, and I do not file a civil claim for the additional damages." I let him read the first paragraph. "If you sign this today," I said, "your name stays out of the courts. The estate gets repaid. And we both walk away from here and figure out how to be siblings again. Or we don't. But that's a choice we make later without lawyers present." I paused. "If you don't sign," I said, "I file the referral on my way out of this building. I have everything packaged and ready. The tracing report, the incorporation records, the transaction logs, the pattern analysis showing deliberate structuring. A Crown attorney I consulted with informally 3 months ago described it as, and I'm quoting him, a very clean file." Daniel looked at the agreement for a long time. Richard read it over his shoulder. They had a conversation in murmurs that I wasn't meant to hear, and I looked down at my hands and waited. Our mother was crying quietly. I hadn't heard her start. Aunt Patricia was sitting with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere near the middle of the table, and I didn't know what she was thinking and I wasn't sure I needed to. Daniel picked up the pen. He signed. He didn't look at me when he did it. He set the pen down neatly, the way he always set things down, precisely, with an air of control over small objects that he had lost over everything larger. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room without speaking. Richard gathered his papers slowly, nodded at Susan Holloway, gave me a look that I couldn't entirely read somewhere between professional respect and mild personal embarrassment, and followed his client out. The room was very quiet. Susan Holloway looked at me for a moment. "That was a significant amount of patience," she said. I nodded. I was starting to feel the tiredness that had been waiting behind everything. I said, "My father spent 40 years being careful. He built something small and solid. I wasn't going to let it disappear quietly while everyone assumed I was too much of a mess to notice." She closed her notepad, clicked her pen, and said, "I don't think I need to schedule a follow-up session." My mother caught me in the hallway outside. She looked smaller than she had inside the room. She reached out and touched my arm and started to say something about how she hadn't known. She hadn't realized. She hoped I understood that she had just been worried about both of us. "I know," I said. "I know you were." I meant it. That was the hard part, not Daniel's betrayal, which had been awful and clarifying in the way that awful things sometimes are. The hard part was my mother's face in that room, realizing that the story she had believed about her children, the narrative she'd arranged her family around, had been missing most of the important facts for a very long time. That's a grief that doesn't resolve in a hallway. I knew that. I gave her a hug, and I told her we'd talk properly, and I meant that too. I walked out of the building onto Bay Street and stood for a moment in the flat October light. It was the kind of cold that doesn't quite bite yet, that just reminds you it's coming. I thought about my father. I thought about how he used to sit at the kitchen table with the Globe and Mail and a cup of tea, reading the business section with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. He never made a lot of noise. He just paid attention. He just kept showing up and doing the careful work. I thought, I learned that from you. I hope you knew. The 90-day repayment clock started that afternoon. Daniel paid in 3 installments, each one on time, which told me his accountant had more sense than he did. The estate was made whole. The Hamilton property repair got booked with a licensed contractor in November. The investment account was professionally reviewed and rebalanced in the new year. I am still the executor. I take that seriously. I also went home that evening and deleted Daniel's number from my phone. Not forever, maybe, but for now. Because forgiveness and proximity are 2 different things, and I'm old enough to know that loving someone and protecting yourself from them are not mutually exclusive. You can do both. It just takes practice. Some people will hear this and say I should have confronted him earlier, that I should have given him a chance to stop before it reached $287,000. And I understand that. I've turned it over many times. But here is what I know from my work, and from watching families tear themselves apart over money that never mattered as much as the trust that went with it. A person who is willing to steal from their grieving family in small, careful increments, always just under the limit, always with a plausible explanation, that person has made a decision about who they are in relation to you. One confrontation doesn't undo that decision. It just makes them more careful the next time. I needed it to be undeniable, not for the courts, for him, and maybe, honestly, for me. Because the version of me that walks into that mediation room with half a case and hope is the version of me that my family had always expected. The emotional one. The one who tries and fails and needs to be managed. The version of me that walked in with a blue folder and 11 months of documented evidence is the one I spent a long time becoming. Some things you earn quietly, over years, while everyone else is busy deciding who you are. And some days, you get to set the folder on the table.